In a mountain cave called El Portalón, tucked inside the world-famous Atapuerca site in northern Spain, archaeologists spent years pulling human bones and stone tools out of 10,000 years of undisturbed sediment, uncovering what one researcher called a detailed book of human history. But when scientists finally sequenced the DNA hidden inside 8 skeletons buried there between roughly 5,500 and 3,500 years ago, they discovered something that completely upended one of the most cherished and widely repeated legends in all of European anthropology. For over a century, scientists, historians, and the Basque people themselves had operated under one central assumption, that the Basques were living fossils, a genuinely ancient population directly descended from Ice Age hunter-gatherers who had survived in unbroken isolation in their mountainous corner of Europe since long before farming, before writing, before almost every other European population had even formed. It was a beautiful, almost mythic, origin story. And the DNA proved it was wrong. So if you think you already understand where the Basque people actually come from, stay with me because ancient genetics has completely rewritten this story. And what it reveals instead is stranger, more layered, and in some ways even more remarkable than the old legend it replaced. Let's start with why this mystery captivated researchers for so long in the first place. Because the Basque country genuinely is one of the strangest anomalies anywhere on the entire European genetic and cultural map. Nestled along the Atlantic coast, where northern Spain meets southwestern France, the Basque people speak a language called Euskera that linguists have never been able to connect to any other language family on the planet, not Indo-European, not anything else recognized anywhere in the world, making it one of the last surviving language isolates in all of Europe. Their physical geography, a landscape of steep mountains, dense forests, and difficult terrain, historically made the region unusually hard to conquer and settle compared to the flatter, more accessible regions surrounding it. And genetically, researchers had long noticed that the Basques showed distinct patterns setting them apart clearly from their immediate neighbors in both France and Spain. Put all of that together, a completely unique language, a historically defensible and isolated homeland, and clear genetic distinctiveness, and it is easy to understand why generations of scientists assumed the simplest explanation must be true, that the Basques represented an untouched relic population, descendants of the very first hunter-gatherers who colonized Iberia after the last ice age, who simply never experienced the same waves of migration, farming, and conquest that reshaped every other population across the rest of the continent. This is precisely the assumption the 2015 study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and led by population geneticist Matthias Jakobsen of Uppsala University, set out to finally test using real genetic evidence rather than speculation. His team sequenced genome-wide data from those 8 skeletons recovered from El Portalón cave, individuals who had lived in the millennia immediately following the arrival of farming in Iberia, and the results directly contradicted the old hunter-gatherer relic theory. These ancient individuals were not the descendants of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had somehow remained untouched by the agricultural revolution sweeping across Europe. They were farmers, carrying genetic ancestry tracing back to Anatolia, the region that is now Turkey, the same original source population responsible for spreading agriculture across almost the entirety of Europe beginning around 7,000 years ago. Jakobsen stated the findings directly, explaining that the results showed Basques trace their ancestry to early farming groups from Iberia, which contradicted the previous, long-held view that they descended from Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations instead. In other words, the Basques were never a frozen-in-time relic of the original Ice Age population of Europe. They were, at their genetic core, descendants of the same Neolithic farming migration wave that transformed nearly the entire continent, no more ancient in their fundamental origin than the ancestors of the French, the Spanish, or the English standing right next door to them. But if the Basques descend from the exact same Neolithic farming migration as everyone else in Iberia, why do they look so genetically distinct from their neighbors today? This is where the actual answer turns out to be far more interesting than the myth it replaced, because the researchers found that the El Portalón individuals were not simply similar to modern Basques. They were, out of every ancient population studied anywhere in Iberia, the single closest genetic match to Basques found in the entire dataset. And crucially, the study found that while these ancient farmers shared their fundamental origin with populations across the rest of Iberia and Europe, the specific population that became the modern Basques experienced something the rest of the peninsula did not, an extended, unusually deep period of genetic isolation. Study co-author Colin Smith of La Trobe University explained that the key difference setting the Basques apart from other Iberian groups was that those other populations show distinct signs of later admixture arriving from the east and from North Africa. Genetic contributions the Basque population largely never absorbed, As centuries and then millennia passed, wave after wave of new populations arrived in Iberia and mixed into the broader Spanish and Portuguese gene pool, Bronze Age steppe migrants, Phoenician, Greek, and Roman settlers, Visigothic rulers, and eventually North African populations during the centuries of Islamic rule. Nearly every one of these successive waves left a measurable genetic trace across most of the Iberian Peninsula. But in the mountainous, comparatively difficult to conquer Basque homeland, this ongoing genetic mixing largely did not happen, or happened to a dramatically smaller degree, leaving the Basque population looking today almost like a genetic snapshot frozen at a much earlier point in Iberian history, not because they were older than everyone else, but because they simply absorbed far less of what came later. Jakobsen himself put this distinction directly, and it is worth repeating precisely because it corrects such a widely repeated misconception, stating clearly that even though the Basques share common ancestry with early European farmers just like their neighbors do, the real story is that they have remained comparatively isolated, genetically speaking, for at least the last 5,000 years. That single sentence completely reframes the entire Basque origin mystery. It was never about being older, it was about being more isolated, a population that essentially got off the genetic highway of European history at a certain point and stayed largely on their own path ever since, while population after population around them kept absorbing new genetic material from migrations, conquests, and mixing that continued for thousands of years afterward. Now here is where the story gets genuinely more complicated, and where more recent genetic research has revealed the earlier picture was still not entirely complete, because the Basques were not quite as perfectly totally isolated from every subsequent wave of migration as that initial 2015 study first suggested. When researchers later examined the Y chromosome data, the paternal lineage marker passed exclusively from father to son, they found that the Basque population does carry meaningful ancestry connected to the same steppe-descended bell-beaker migration that transformed so much of the rest of Europe, beginning around 4,500 years ago, the very same population wave responsible for the near-total replacement of local male lineages across most of the rest of Iberia. Researchers dated this steppe-descended R1b ancestry, entering the Basque gene pool to somewhere between roughly 3,700 and 4,500 years ago, depending on the specific Basque province examined, meaning this particular wave of newcomers did successfully reach and settle within the Basque homeland, just as it reached nearly every other corner of Western Europe during the same era. This created a genuine puzzle researchers had to reconcile, because if the Basques absorbed this same steppe ancestry that swept across the rest of the continent, how could they also be the population showing the least genetic mixing from later historical migrations? The answer researchers arrived at is that Basque genetic history unfolded in essentially two distinct phases, rather than one single continuous story. First came that same broad wave of Neolithic farmer migration from Anatolia, shared with the rest of Iberia and Europe. Then came that steppe-descended Bronze Age wave, also shared with the rest of the continent, arriving and mixing into the existing farming population sometime around 4,000 years ago. But after that point, once these two ancestral components had combined to form the genetic foundation of the Basque population, something changed, and the region essentially closed itself off from the ongoing river of migration, conquest, and mixing that continued reshaping nearly every other population in Iberia and across Europe for the following several thousand years. The Basques, in other words, absorbed the same two great ancestral waves that shaped nearly everyone else on the continent, and then simply stopped absorbing new populations at almost exactly the same historical moment, becoming a kind of genetic time capsule, preserving what the broader Iberian gene pool looked like roughly 4,000 years ago, while the rest of the peninsula kept evolving and mixing with newcomer after newcomer for millennia afterward. This remarkable genetic isolation left another kind of fingerprint on the Basque population, one that doctors and geneticists still study directly today because of its measurable medical significance. The Basque country has the highest documented concentration of Rh-negative blood type found anywhere in the entire world, with some estimates placing the frequency among Basques dramatically higher than the roughly 15% average found across most of the rest of Europe. For decades, this striking statistical outlier fueled all kinds of speculation, everything from serious scientific hypotheses to genuinely bizarre pseudoscientific theories, claiming Basque ancestry connected back to extraterrestrial visitors or the lost civilization of Atlantis. The real, evidence-based explanation is far less dramatic but arguably just as interesting, a direct, well-understood consequence of population genetics. When a population remains relatively small and genetically isolated for an extended period of time, as the Basques did for thousands of years, whatever genetic variants happen to already be present within that founding population, purely through the ordinary mechanics of random chance, tend to become concentrated and amplified across the generations that follow, simply because there is less new genetic material flowing in from outside populations to dilute them. The unusually high Rh negative frequency among Basques today is essentially the same genetic phenomenon responsible for elevated rates of specific hereditary conditions found in other long isolated populations around the world, a direct, measurable signature of that same multi-thousand-year genetic isolation confirmed by the broader, ancient DNA research into Basque origins. Now, let's connect this story to something that adds an entirely new, genuinely fascinating dimension, because Basque isolation did not mean total, permanent separation from every other population on Earth. Researchers studying the deep paternal ancestry connected to that same step descended. R1b lineage found in the Basque population made an almost unbelievable discovery when they compared it against genetic data collected from populations across the rest of Europe. That the closest genetic match anywhere on the entire continent to the Basque population was not found in neighboring France or Spain at all, but on a small windswept island sitting well over 1,000 miles away across open ocean, Ireland. Detailed genetic comparisons, plotting the distances between different European Y chromosome populations, found that Irish populations cluster directly inside the Basque genetic grouping itself, sitting closest of all specifically to the Basque province of Guipuzcoa, a genetic connection so specific and so pronounced that researchers still consider it one of the most striking long-distance genetic matches found anywhere in European population genetics. The explanation traces back to that same step, descended Bell-Beaker migration wave that reached both regions at remarkably similar points in history, somewhere between roughly 3,700 and 4,500 years ago, carrying nearly identical paternal R1b genetic lineages into both the Basque country and Ireland simultaneously. And afterward, both regions followed a strikingly similar historical path, remaining comparatively insulated from many of the later population upheavals that reshaped so much of the rest of the continent, protected in Ireland's case by its island geography at the extreme western edge of Europe, and in the Basque country's case by its rugged, historically difficult-to-conquer mountainous terrain. Two populations separated by an enormous stretch of ocean and land, speaking two completely unrelated languages, nonetheless ended up preserving nearly identical genetic echoes of the exact same ancient migration wave, simply because both happened to be located at the far hard, to reach edges of the same continent, and both happened to largely opt out of the centuries of subsequent migration and mixing that reshaped almost everyone standing between them. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth examining closely, because it reveals just how consistently this isolation held, even into the more recent historical era, long after the ancient farming and steppe migrations had already settled into place. When researchers compared the genetic makeup of the Basque population against the rest of Iberia, across the centuries of Roman, Visigothic, and Islamic rule that so thoroughly reshaped the broader Spanish and Portuguese gene pool, they found the Basque country was remarkably, consistently absent from nearly every one of these later waves. While the rest of Iberia was absorbing substantial North African ancestry during the centuries of Muslim rule beginning in 701 AD, eventually reaching close to 50% ancestry in some medieval Islamic period, Iberian populations, studied through ancient DNA, the Basque homeland, protected by its mountainous terrain and its position at the edge of the peninsula, was barely touched by the same demographic transformation. The same pattern holds for the Roman Empire, whose administrative and genetic influence spread across nearly every corner of Iberia during centuries of imperial rule, and for the Visigothic kingdom that followed Rome's collapse, bringing genetic influence connected all the way back through Central and Eastern Europe toward Asia into much of the rest of the peninsula. The Basque country experienced comparatively minimal genetic input from any of these successive conquering populations, an almost unbroken, multi-thousand-year pattern of relative isolation that stands in stark contrast to nearly every other region studied anywhere in Iberia, and quite possibly anywhere else in continental Europe. So what does the complete picture actually reveal when you assemble every layer of this research together? It reveals a population whose true origin story is almost the mirror opposite of the romantic legend that surrounded them for so long. The Basques were never an ancient, untouched relic of the very first Ice Age hunter-gatherers to settle Iberia, standing apart from history since before agriculture existed. Genetically, at their core, they descend from the same Anatolian farming migration that transformed the rest of Europe roughly 7,000 years ago, exactly like nearly every other population on the continent. They then absorbed the same steppe-descended bronze, age migration wave that reshaped Ireland, Scotland, Spain, and so much of the rest of Europe roughly 4,000 years ago, carrying the same R1b paternal lineage found today in populations as geographically distant as rural Ireland. What actually makes the Basques genuinely unique is not some deeper, more ancient origin than everyone else. It is what happened, or rather, what largely did not happen, in the thousands of years that followed. While the rest of Iberia and Europe kept absorbing wave after wave of new populations, Roman settlers, Visigothic rulers, North African communities, and countless smaller migrations layered on top of each other across millennia, the Basque homeland, protected by rugged terrain and centuries of fierce cultural and political independence, largely closed itself off from that ongoing river of genetic mixing, preserving instead something closer to a snapshot of what the broader Iberian population looked like roughly 4,000 years in the past, still visible today in their elevated Rh-negative blood frequencies, their unbroken linguistic isolation, and the striking, almost eerie genetic echo connecting them across an entire ocean to the equally isolated island of Ireland. It is, in the end, a far more interesting and far more human story than the old myth it replaced. Not a population frozen since the dawn of humanity, untouched by history entirely, but a population that walked the exact same early path as everyone else in Europe, farmers descended from Anatolia, then herders carrying steppe ancestry from the east, and then, at a specific, identifiable moment roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, simply chose, whether through geography, culture, fierce independence, or some combination of all three, to step largely outside the flow of everything that came afterward, while the rest of the continent kept mixing, conquering, and being conquered in turn. Every Basque person alive today carries inside their DNA a genuine, direct, unbroken thread connecting them to those early Anatolian farmers and step-descended herders, preserved with a clarity and consistency found almost nowhere else in Europe. Not because their ancestors were somehow more ancient or more pure than anyone else's, but because their ancestors, uniquely among nearly every population on the continent, largely managed to hold the rest of history at arm's length for well over 4,000 years, leaving behind a genetic record so distinct, so consistent, and so remarkably well preserved that scientists studying it today can still read, with startling clarity, exactly what a corner of Bronze Age Europe looked like, simply by sequencing the DNA of the people still living there right now.